I always know a little bit about the peak that I'm climbing. So we're going to just do a quick overview of history, the first ascents of Aconcagua. We'll talk about the most popular routes on that mountain, as well as the typical climbing season and what the weather looks like, which is often something that people, I think, don't anticipate. We'll talk about the terrain specific to the two most popular climbing routes, and then some progression. So what skills do you need before you attempt Aconcagua? We'll talk about training, and then common mistakes. So I've coached a lot of people who have summited this peak, and I wanted to share the things that I've learned as their coach. And then we'll have some time for questions. So please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We'll start with questions from there, and then we can talk live, of course, as well. So I climbed Aconcagua in 2011 via the 360 route, which we'll talk about. And at that point, so I had been climbing then for about 4 years, and it was by far the hardest mountain I had climbed until that up to that point. So I just want to again share some things that I learned during that process. So a little bit of background though, and some history. As I said, I think it's important to understand sort of, the mountain and the places that we're climbing in. So the Huarpe people were the first to occupy the area around what we now call Aconcagua. The first attempted ascent of that peak was in 1883. And the first female ascent wasn't that long later. It was in 1908. The first summit occurred in 1911, and we'll look at a little bit about both of these first ascensionists. But the name Aconcagua probably comes from the Quechua language. So that's the language spoken by the indigenous people in that area in the Andes. And we're not totally clear on what Aconcagua means, what the interpretation is from that language, but most commonly what I hear is that it means stone sentinel. Another possible interpretation is that it means snowy peak, although today there's not a lot of snow on Aconcagua. It's a pretty dry mountain. So that's a little bit of history. The first ascent was by a Swiss man, Matthias Zurbriggen. He had many first ascents. He climbed a lot in the Alps, of course, also in the Andes, in the Himalayas, and in New Zealand. And if anyone's familiar with Mount Cook, there's a famous ridge there that's named after him. Interesting fact, he summited in 1908. He summited Aconcagua alone because most of his party turned around because of the weather on the way to the summit. So he stood on the summit alone for the first time. And then the first female ascent happened a few years later by an American. Her name was Annie Smith Peck, and such a fascinating, I put some information about her in the reference slide at the very end of the deck. So she was a teacher. She was also a suffragist. She attempted Aconcagua when she was 58 years old. So I'm almost 51. I can't imagine climbing that peak at that age. She didn't summit that year, but she came back and became the first woman to summit in 1908. And she got a lot of crap about her dress. You can see in this photo, she's wearing pants, which obviously was very uncommon back then. Even for women who did climb in that era, they often wore long dresses. And she was one of the first women to start to wear pants. So a really interesting life that she had. And again, there's more info about her in the reference slide. Okay, so looking at the peak itself, the Stone Sentinel, it has a lot of distinction. So it's the highest peak in both the southern and the western hemisphere. It's the highest peak outside of the Himalayas. So it's 22,834 feet or 6,962 meters above sea level. Aconcagua is on the border of Argentina and Chile. And the typical climbing season, in fact, this is just when the park is open for climbing. You won't be given a permit if, let's say, you wanted to climb it in April. Obviously, that's winter in South America. So the typical climbing season starts now and goes to early mid-March, depending on conditions. And about 3,500 people each year will attempt the summit, most of them on the two routes that we'll talk about. The success rate varies pretty widely. So anywhere from 35% to 60%, but it is not a mountain that has a really high success rate. And we'll talk a little bit about some reasons why that is. So again, we're going to look at the two most popular routes. The most popular, and probably 90+% of people attempt this route. It's called the normal route. It starts in the Hornaconas Valley. Both of these routes don't require any sort of technical climbing skills. This route will take you, most guide companies will plan about 3 weeks of climbing, so something like 18 to 21 days. It's 42 miles long, so much longer than a lot of other peaks. Maybe, I guess it's similar to peaks in the Himalaya if you have a long ascent or long approach. And you'll gain on this route 13,500 feet of elevation to get to the summit. So that's the normal route. And you can compare that to the 360-degree route. This is the route that I climbed in 2011. So this starts in the Vacas Valley, which is the valley east of the Hornaconas Valley. And you can see it starts here, and you ascend until you get to Plaza Argentina, which is here. Then you sort of curve around, and you actually use 2 camps on what's called the Polish route, which is a much more challenging route. And then you intersect the normal route and then reach the summit. It's similar in length and elevation gain. So this route is 64 miles long and about 15,000 feet of elevation gain. Both routes, again, don't require any technical climbing experience. They both start from about 9,000 feet and have base camps at about 14,000 feet. So those are the two most popular routes. There are many, many other routes. And then one of the books that's referenced in the last slide sort of goes through all of them. There's some beautiful alpine routes that are rarely climbed. One in particular, the south face of Aconcagua, has 9,000 feet of sustained climbing. So there's some really challenging routes on this peak. We, of course, climb the easiest, which is either the 360 route or the normal route. And the 360 route is becoming more and more popular. I think most of the people I'm coaching this year are actually climbing this route. So you will expect to see far fewer people on this route, which I think is part of the appeal. It's a little bit longer, of course. And I should say you then descend the normal route. So you ascend through the Vacas Valley, and then you descend through the Hornaconas Valley. So you get also to see, much more of the terrain of the peak without a lot of people. So I really, if people ask me which route to pick, I would pick that one for that reason. Okay, weather. So I think a lot of people underestimate how harsh the weather can be on Aconcagua. And we'll look, I actually took a snapshot from Mountain Forecast. But just to give you sort of an overview of what it can be like. So at lower elevation, so say base camp, which is 14,000 feet, if we're talking about the normal routes, the typical weather this month will be sort of comfortable between 40 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's not uncommon for there to be like a dusting of snow at base camp. It usually doesn't stick around for very long, but it can definitely happen. And then as you climb higher, you'll see that the temperatures often are below 0 on both scales. So summit temperatures can very often be -20 Celsius or Fahrenheit. So it can be really harsh. I think that's one of the things I want to impress upon each of you, that this is a challenging mountain to climb with very challenging weather to work with. So that's temperature. And then if we look at precip, this generally is not your biggest challenge. Aconcagua is a very dry mountain, and you'll see in all of these photos, which are taken from the mountain, that there's often like a few inches, maybe a foot of fresh snow. It's very dry snow. It usually at lower elevations especially doesn't last for very long. On either of the normal routes, I've never heard of there being avalanche risk. So it's generally pretty dry. So deep snow is not going to be your challenge. What may be your challenge is the wind. So this peak is known for very strong winds, especially the higher you get. When I climbed in 2011, we reached on the 360 route, we reached Camp 2, which is at about 18,000 feet. And I remember, so this was sort of the first time that I really had to deal with scary weather in the mountains. There were 5 people on my team. It was a guided trip. And it took the 5 of us 3 hours to set up 2 tents because it was so windy. So we, anything that wasn't tied down was going to blow away. We had to, pile rocks on top of our backpack so they didn't blow away. We eventually had to take turns like sitting inside the tent and trying to warm our hands up so we could, swap in and out of working to get the tents set up. It was very arduous. And for me, as a relatively new mountaineer, it was pretty scary as well. I remember we tied a string between our tents, and that's how we would like pass boiled water back and forth. And the wind, we had to get up in the middle of the night and retie the guy lines and make sure everything was solid overnight. So be prepared for harsh conditions. That was only at 17,000 or maybe 18,000 feet. It of course passed and the weather improved and we were able to summit in really nice conditions, but it's not uncommon to deal with a lot of heavy wind on Aconcagua. And so I was curious, so I pulled this, I looked at Mountain Forecasts, which is a great resource if you're interested in mountain weather. It's just mountainforecast.com, and it will show you the weather for peaks all over the world. So just to orient yourself a little bit, you can use either Fahrenheit or Celsius. I've selected Fahrenheit for this example, and I pulled this like a couple weeks ago. So you can see for this 5-day stretch that the wind is going to, at the lowest, be about 35 miles an hour. And at the highest, this is on the summit, check this out, over 100 miles an hour forecasted. I will say I think Mountain Forecast overstates the wind a bit, but regardless, very windy stretch of time just before the beginning of the official climbing season on Aconcagua. Snowfall, this is in inches, a little significant, 8 inches in one day, followed by 3 inches on the day before and the day after. And then temperatures. So this is something to think about as you're planning your gear. So at no point during this 5-day stretch was it going to be above freezing in Fahrenheit on the summit. In fact, some temperatures, who knows if it really felt this low, but minus 80, minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit would have been the feels like temperature. So I hope that this is impressing upon you that it's not, it's a harsh mountain. It's really harsh conditions, challenging weather. If you're planning to go to Aconcagua this season, I would definitely start checking out Mountain Forecasts, just like a couple times a week, log in and see what the weather is forecasted to be like. You can select different elevations in Mountain Forecast. This is, of course, the summit, but it helps you just become familiar with what you can expect when you're actually going to be there. So then talking about terrain, I always tell people if you're going to climb the normal routes or the typical routes that it's really just a giant pile of rock, which is not my favorite kind of climbing. I remember thinking there's every single kind of rock you can imagine. There's sand when you're down low walking in the valleys. There are pebbles, there are stones, there's talus, there's scree, there are boulders, just every kind of rock you can imagine you will experience on Aconcagua. This is a section of the route you can kind of see just faintly the trail right here on the 360 route. This is between Plaza Argentina and the first camp. So there probably will be snow, especially up high. There could be just a dusting of it. But most of the time that you're on the mountain, the terrain that you will experience and that you need to be comfortable moving efficiently in is going to be rock. That's why it's called the Stone Sentinel. So thinking then just about like, if you're planning Aconcagua, what skills do you need to be successful and comfortable on that mountain? What is sort of the optional progression of other mountains that you want to climb on your way there? And this again is considering the typically climbed routes. So there's no technical climbing experience required. Most guide companies now are requesting that you bring crampons and an ice axe. And usually on summit day, your guides will have a rope just in case something goes wrong. You may put those crampons on summit day, depending on conditions, and you'll probably have your ice axe out, but it is certainly not even like, climbing Mount Rainier in terms of being on a heavily glaciated terrain. It's going to be mostly rock. There's not a lot of exposure on those typically climbed routes, which I think makes it a good sort of, high altitude beginner peak for a lot of people. So if exposure is something that you're still getting comfortable with, you shouldn't have to worry about sort of looking down and seeing like, just a mile of free space beneath you and making that uneasy for you. You do climb in expedition style. So you will expect to do carries. And so what that means is that you may leave camp 1 with half your gear. So things you aren't going to need for 24 hours, like extra clothes, maybe your high altitude boots, some food, some fuel, and you'll carry that amount of gear to camp 2 in this example, leave it there, cache it there, and then return and sleep back at camp 1. And then the next day you'll pack up the rest of your gear and actually move it to camp 2. So that's sort of different than climbing lower peaks, where you would just be moving at once with all your gear. Because it's so heavy, you will do carries. So it'll take you 2 days basically to move all your gear from one camp to the next. And that of course helps you to acclimatize as well. It's very common now to use porters on Aconcagua, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I would say now probably 80% of people do who are going on guided expeditions. So that will reduce your pack weight probably to like 20 or 25 pounds. So sort of like a heavy day pack. Without the use of a porter, your backpack will probably weigh, I would train for 50 pounds. It may be a little bit less than that, but it will certainly be pretty heavy. Last year's, to give you there's a cost obviously to use the local porters. They would carry 20 kilograms from base camp to camp 3. So they're sort of, being with you every day and carrying whatever you give them that weighs up to 20 kilograms. And that would cost you $1,000 for the expedition. Some guide companies now are this is how they climb Aconcagua. They always use porters. I think there's really good reason for that. And we'll get to that in a little bit, but just to give you sort of a sense of pack weight. I think you also have to be very comfortable descending. Usually it's not a problem for people to ascend steep, loose rock, but often people, if you haven't done it a lot, it gets a little uncomfortable to descend steep, loose rock and scree. So all those kinds of rock, sand, talus, boulders, pebbles, all that rock. And you're doing it in mountaineering boots. You probably won't put your boots on depending on temperatures and snow conditions. You may not need them until camp 3, but I think it's still important to be comfortable ascending and descending that type of terrain in big, bulky, stiff mountaineering boots. And I would say you should be comfortable with sort of the expedition lifestyle too. For many people, this is their first big mountain that they've climbed. That was definitely true for me. And I wasn't 100% prepared to eat weird food for 3 weeks straight, to have as much downtime as you have on an expedition, to deal with getting sick and having to get well again, still being on the mountain. So all of those things, that expedition lifestyle, I think is another thing that you should be comfortable with. I've coached several people who've said, had aspirations to maybe climb the 7 summits, and they went to Aconcagua and they're like, yeah, I don't like it. I don't like not showering for 14 days. And it really affected them more than they anticipated that it would. So being mindful of just what your day-to-day routine is going to be like and how that might be stressful, I think is important as well when you're considering climbing Aconcagua. So I touched on it a little bit, but just progression, what are the mountains you should climb first? I really think, it's important to have some experience on something like the Cascades or 14ers in Colorado, particularly in the winter when the weather is harsher. Climbing those first allows you to start to build some skills and experience, and I would say just resilience as well in less than ideal circumstances. It also lets you tweak your gear, get your layering systems solidified, and just start to get comfortable being in the mountains. And then from there, I would add some elevation to the mix. So on lesser technical terrain, so Kilimanjaro is a great example. You can get up to 19,000 feet. Same in Ecuador, or even the volcanoes in Mexico. So that allows you to see how your body performs at elevation and just what it feels like to be at that elevation. What does it feel like to have a little bit of AMS? What does it feel like to lose your appetite when you know you need to eat for fuel? I think adding elevation earlier is a really important way to like build up to being on a bigger mountain. And also, like I said, gives you a taste of what it's like to be on an expedition lifestyle. Not so true for Ecuador, where you're probably going to stay in huts most of the time, but Kilimanjaro, you get a little bit of a sense of that. I think there's a lot less, typically if you're on Kilimanjaro, you arrive at the next camp and your tent is all set up for you, and there's a nice dining tent with a table and chairs. Nobody's going to do that for you on Aconcagua, but you do get the feeling of what it's like to continually ascend to higher and higher peaks, and to not be able to come back to base camp, which is different than climbing, say, in the Himalaya. And then I would really spend some time. I know not everyone has access to steep, rocky terrain, but the more time you can spend just on your feet in that environment, especially wearing mountaineering boots, the more comfortable you're going to be on Aconcagua. And then in terms of skills, I think the biggest things really are to build endurance, strength, and resilience. So doing some longer endeavors in, whatever you have access to at home. So long hikes, and by long, I would mean 6 hours plus, long runs, maybe a century ride, something that really pushes you mentally while you're being tested physically. I think it's important to put yourself in that position so that you know how to dig deep if you have to, and you sort of know, like, how does it feel when I'm starting to fatigue, and what are my tools to start to work through that. So being in those long endeavors where you're building resilience, not just physically, but also mentally, I think is really important. Getting used to doing an alpine start is important. So it's, very sort of discombobulating to wake up at 10 p.m. and have to put on all your layers and force yourself to eat and start moving in the middle of the night. And for some people, it really, is just a lot of stress to have to go through that. So the more often you can do it, the easier it will be, and the more natural I think it will become. Same for winter camping. If you have access to, it doesn't have to be on like a big steep mountain, but if you can at least get out and like see what it's like to camp overnight in the snow and have to melt all of your water and have to like layer up and have to figure out how to go to the bathroom when you've got 5 layers on. All of those little things that aren't necessarily climbing skills will make you more confident and also more resilient when it counts, when you're on the mountain. And so gear, obviously, whatever guide company you go with is going to give you an exhaustive gear list, but there's a couple of things that I just wanted to point out. A lot of guide companies are requesting that you have a 90-liter backpack. I think you can this is their call, obviously, but my opinion is that you could get away, I think, with 75 if you were using a porter. So that's something to maybe check into, especially if you don't have a 90-liter backpack. You probably wouldn't use a backpack that big anywhere else except Denali. So inquire if you are using a porter, if you could take a smaller backpack. Your sleeping bag needs to be at least 25 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 25 degree Fahrenheit rated. And if you're going to Everest, I would probably just get a -40 bag. So you'll have that, I think the sooner you can buy those things, the more you can spread out those expenses, the easier it is. So at least a -25-degree down bag. Double boots for sure. You saw the temperatures, the typical temperatures. You will certainly need those when you get above Camp 3. Really sturdy trekking poles. So Aconcagua, as I said, being all rock, I've seen it break many trekking poles. So be sure you have a really sturdy pair. I like now the Z design, so the kind that sort of folds into a Z as opposed to the telescoping kind. I think the telescoping kind can often get just debris or dirt in the poles, and sometimes when you're relying on it, you're really weighting it, they will collapse unexpectedly, which is no fun and potentially dangerous. So get good trekking poles. You really do want a heavy down parka, and you very likely will be climbing in it if it gets really cold and windy. Same with down pants. If you don't climb in them, they just make being at camp a lot more comfortable. And then invest in some good approach shoes or boots, whatever you prefer, because you could be wearing them up to Camp 3. If it's not snowy and the temperatures are manageable, you can get by with wearing them for quite a bit of the climb. Guide companies are requesting now that you bring a harness. It's unlikely you would wear it, so bring a really light one. Like Petzl Altitude, I think, is the model is super lightweight. Just bring a light one. You probably won't need it, but you're going to be carrying it with you the whole time. And then crampons and ice axe. Like I said before, you will probably only put those on summit day. You won't be wearing them the whole time, but you do need to have them just depending on what the conditions are like. And then just a quick walkthrough of what the expeditions are like. So these are true for both the 360 route and the normal route. You're going to start at about 9,000 feet and you're going to walk to about 14,000 feet which is where base camp is. And the mules will be carrying your gear up until base camp. So your backpack is going to be, 10 pounds or whatever is what you need for the day. Your biggest challenge here is going to be not overheating, not getting sunburnt, and you're definitely going to be dirty. So it's going to be hot and dusty and dry and sunny. And you just want to make sure like you want to arrive at base camp, obviously, as healthy as you possibly can be. So really be mindful of taking care of yourself here. Don't get sunburned because it's just more stress for your body to have to endure. Try to stay as hydrated as you can. I always tell people when they, especially if you're on a commercial expedition, don't compete. You're not competing with anybody at this point. Don't try to go faster than someone else. Just sort of do your thing and have a nice walk to base camp. It really is a beautiful, beautiful terrain, and your backpack will be light. It should be like I said, the biggest challenge will be not getting sunburnt. And then you'll do those carries. So you'll start from base camp. You'll probably do a double carry. So carry half your gear to Camp 1, return and spend the night at base camp. And then the next day, pack up the rest of your gear and carry it to Camp 1, which will be your new high point. So this is different than climbing, say, in the Himalaya, where you climb from base camp to Camp 1, and then you return and spend a few days at base camp, and then you go to Camp 2 and return to base camp. So once on Aconcagua, once you leave base camp, similar to Denali, you're not going to be returning until you're on your way back down. So in some ways that's more challenging, I think, because your body doesn't get a chance to recover at that lower elevation. So just be mindful of like, that's how this is going to go, right? You're going to leave one camp, go to the next and stay there. And those climbs or those hikes in between, you'll gain 2,000 or 3,000 feet a day on pretty tough terrain. We talked about the rock. And you're going to do that day after day for close to 2 weeks. So I think it's just important to get into that mindset of like, this is expedition style climbing where I'm carrying a load and caching it, returning, and then moving the rest of my gear the next day. And it's arduous day after day. Common mistakes. So people very often, if you've studied Aconcagua, you've probably heard this, underestimate that mountain. I think it's because it's not technical. It's outside of the Himalaya. I don't know why, because I think with just a small amount of research, you can get a pretty good feel for how challenging it can be. So people will underestimate the challenge, the harshness of that mountain, how difficult and challenging the weather can be. For many people, it is their first expedition. And so getting used to, like I said, that expedition lifestyle where you might not have an appetite. You might not really like the food that you're given to eat. You may have a little bit of AMS and a headache because of the elevation. You might be homesick. You might be, have a lot of downtime and just be sort of bored with what to do with that downtime. So getting in that mindset of this is what my day-to-day is going to be like, I think is really important and helps people to avoid a mistake that I see people make a lot. The other challenge is just carrying a heavy backpack on that type of terrain at that elevation. So I've coached many people who are really strong at sea level. So, people who could ascend 6,000 feet in a day with a 50-pound backpack and go for a 10-mile trail run the next day and feel fine. So really strong athletes who wanted to carry all of their own gear on Aconcagua, which is fantastic. And then got to the mountain, got to, even just camp one and said, this is way harder than I thought it was going to be because of the elevation. It wasn't that they were, incapable of carrying that type of load on that terrain, but the elevation is just a whole another level. So unless someone is really, really adamant that they want to carry all of their own gear, my advice, and some guide companies are just doing this as a matter of course now, is to use a porter. I, in 2011, totally fell in that category of wanting to carry all of my own gear, and I got as high as Camp 2, and I just said I was moving so slowly that, if my goal is to summit, I felt like my choice to carry my own gear was detrimental. So I just split a porter, and you can split porters, and gave him like 10 kilograms, and my partner gave him 10 kilograms. And then it was a much more pleasant climb from then on out. So really consider using a porter. How to avoid common mistakes. So study the mountain. Anyone that I coach will hear me say this over and over again. And that means attending webinars like this. That means reading blogs, reading books, talking to other people, watching YouTube videos. And when you're studying it, get a sense of like, what are people like? If I'm just looking at this picture, I'm like, how big is that person's backpack? Where are they on the mountain? What kind of boots are they wearing? Are they wearing down pants? Do they have crampons on yet? So like just getting a sense of what it's like to be on that mountain, and do your best to mimic that with what you have available to you. So, break out, look at your itinerary for your climb, break that out by elevation gain per day, and try to mimic that. Try to gain, say, 3,000 feet at this sort of an incline, so over a certain number of miles with a 40-pound pack, and then do that the next day, and then maybe take a day off and do it the day after that. So do your best to mimic it. Wear your mountain boots when you're doing that. Wear crampons if you can. Just really try to get acclimated mentally and physically to what the climb is going to be like. I really think it's great to get some experience at elevation. That may come from climbing another peak like Kilimanjaro, or spending time on the volcanoes in Ecuador or Mexico, but really see how your body reacts to elevation. There's no guarantee that how your body reacted on one mountain and how quickly you acclimated is going to exactly be replicated on the next mountain you climb. But it's pretty fair to say that if you acclimatize quickly, you probably will the next time. It's not a guarantee. It certainly happened to me where I felt like things weren't going the way I expected them to, but it at least gets you used to that process of acclimatizing. and you know what it feels like to be at elevation and have a headache and need to force yourself to eat because you don't have an appetite. I also think it suits people well to get in some harsh weather if you can do that in a safe environment. So if you know, have access to be in Colorado in the winter, for example, you can, you know, do some winter backpacking. I coached someone last year for Aconcagua, and she lived in Iowa, but she just, you know, put her tent up and slept in her backyard a few times just to get used to being in harsh weather and having to like put your boots on with heavy gloves on and get dressed that way and go to the bathroom that way. All those little things add up to, you know, to building confidence and also to making your climb much easier if you've had some experience. Do some winter backpacking, and above all, take care of yourself on the mountain. You know, eat, drink, sleep as much as you can, tend to whatever, you know, blisters, headache, whatever you need to. Just don't let those things go, because they will very quickly start to compound and become very difficult. The year that I climbed, one person on our team actually got pulmonary edema just before the summit, and we had to rescue her. And she hadn't been communicating that she was feeling out of it and, you know, wasn't doing well. And it just, I think the more you can take care of yourself, the better teammate you are. And it also just puts you in a better position to be ready and safe on the summit. And then the last tip, of course, is training. So this is just a snapshot from an Alpine Athletics training plan. So a typical week, I think this is like maybe 3 months before the end of the training plan. But people often ask me, when should I start training? And there's not a cut and dry answer to that question, because, you know, some people like climbed a mountain a year ago and they haven't done anything since then. And some people, you know, swim 3 hours 3 times a week, and they hike every weekend. And, you know, people are always coming with just different backgrounds. But I would say in general, you should start at least 6 months before your summit day. I think 9 months is even better, because it helps you build a really solid cardiovascular base. So you follow me, you've heard me say that many, many times. Having that just super solid cardiovascular ability is what's going to allow you to climb hour after hour, day after day in the mountains. It's something that can't be circumvented. You can't skip that part of the process. You will certainly pay for it if you try. And starting, say, 9 months as opposed to 6 months gives you the extra time to do that. It also allows for things like, you know, you get sick or you have to travel unexpectedly for work, or, you know, just life happens and your training doesn't go quite as smoothly as you thought it would. So start early. Decide a couple months into your training, decide whether or not you're going to use porters, because that will dictate your strength training. And if you are not going to use porters, then I would recommend, you know, mimicking your day-to-day on the mountain and training up to carrying probably 55 pounds. I like for people to carry a little bit more weight than they think their backpack will be on the mountain, so that they're prepared, and, you know, hopefully it just doesn't feel as heavy. But you'll have to build strength accordingly. It's a much different picture if you're using a porter, you're not going to be carrying that much weight. When I'm putting training plans together for people, I think about what their movement is going to be like on the mountain. So there is very, very little upper body work on Aconcagua. 90+% of what's getting you up and down that mountain is your lower body and core. And if you think about just locomotion, you know, human walking, you're really pushing off of one leg. So a lot of one-legged movements will also serve you well as you're getting ready for Aconcagua. So single leg squats, for example, are great. Single leg deadlifts are great. And then plan for 2 months of muscular endurance work. So this is the last phase, my favorite phase of training, where you're really focusing. You've now got a super solid cardiovascular base. You've built the right amount of strength that's aligned with what that mountain is going to demand of you. And now you're going to shift to doing many, many repetitions of movements similar to how you'll move on the mountain without a lot of weight. So maybe 10 or 15% of your body weight. Spending at least a couple months in that phase really serves people well. It's not always the funnest mode of training or phase of training, but it really makes a difference when you're on the mountain. So that's the bulk of what I wanted to talk about. We have a few minutes left. I have some references. Everyone will get this slide deck and you'll have access to these references. But let's start with questions. And let me see if I can pull up the chat. I don't see any questions in there. So let me, if you have a question, if you can unmute yourself and we'll take a few questions. Hi, Melanie.
Hi, I have one question. First of all, thank you so much. This is so insightful and a little scary, but great intel all around. So thank you so much for setting this up. My question is around, so what happens if someone in the group has an issue? Let's just say AMS, wrong gear, for whatever reason, that person has to go back down.
Yeah.
What are the scenarios there? Like, can you help that person go back down and go back up? Is the guide to customer ratio such that customers stay on the mountain and those people are helped by, the guides? Like, what happens when those situations occur?
Really good question. So your guide company will know what their guide to client ratio is. They should be able to tell you what that is. It's probably something like 3 to 1 or 2 to 1, I would guess, for Aconcagua. And so if you're on the mountain and someone needs to turn around, there's a couple of scenarios. I've seen it happen where that person who needs to turn around might actually tag along with assuming they're ambulatory and, pretty able to take care of themselves. They may tag along with another team that's descending, that's already summited and is on their way down. When I summited Denali, that happened. So there was, a guy who turned around, say, at Camp 2, and he just tagged along with my team as we were going down. So guide companies will work together that way because they want to maintain that client to guide ratio as much as they can. If that's not an option, then the more junior guide will take that person down and work with them to get them, if they're going to stay at base camp while you climb, or if they're going to take the next mule out, or if they're going to fly out, get those logistics sorted. And depending then on where the main part of the team is, it's possible that guide could just quickly climb and catch up with the rest of the team to kind of maintain that, client to guide ratio. So there's a lot of different options. Obviously, if the person wasn't able to walk, that's a totally different thing. But if it's just like AMS or they just self-select and want to leave, those are the most common things that I've seen happen. Yeah, good question. It's good to think ahead like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any others? Okay, I'm going to add one topic that I often get questions about, and then we'll close. And that is hypoxic, whether you should use a hypoxic training system. So Aconcagua is a mountain where people commonly want to use it because it's a lot of elevation to gain. And I think I've used one. I have a Hypoxico. When I was climbing the 7 summits, I used it a lot. I slept in it. I exercised with it. It sort of became, I felt like, kind of a secret weapon. I felt like I, needed to do it if I was going to have a successful climb. And I think I've coached many people who've used them. So I definitely think they are beneficial. I think Aconcagua is a good mountain to use them on. What I always tell people is not to use it at the detriment of recovering from your training. So recovery is an important part of training. We often, forget that it has to happen or forget that it's essential, but without that recovery, you're not actually getting stronger. And the best way for us to recover is to sleep. So if you're sleeping in a hypoxic environment, your sleep quality is going to diminish. And if you're waking up and you're feeling cranky, you're feeling really tired, you sort of feel hungover, that's a sign that you're not sleeping well and therefore not recovering well. So if you're going to use if you're going to train hypoxically, I think it's important to start really early. I've talked to, people who have done rapid ascents of Everest using by acclimatizing before they went to the mountain. And her advice was to get in that tent, spend as much time as you possibly can in that hypoxic environment. So start early, because you're going to travel. You're, going to just need a break from the thing. And that gives you plenty of time to still get everything you can of that hypoxic training, and do it very slowly. Really, and I was so bad at this, but really be mindful of what your oxygen saturation is in the morning when you wake up. I'd have to look back the Hypoxico information, but I think if it's below 80, they don't want you moving on to the next elevation. So really be mindful and honest about that, and take your time and let your body acclimatize, and don't compromise your recovery as a result of sleeping in a hypoxic environment. So that is it. I'll just ask real quickly if there's any other questions. And then if not, we'll conclude things for today. Thank you for taking your time to show up. If you're headed to Aconcagua, I wish you all the best. And if you have other questions or want to chat, please reach out and let me know. I'd be happy to talk more. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.